Hello everyone. Welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video, we're going to take a look at question 18, articles 2 through 4, where Aquinas gets into the three parts of action that must be good for the action to be good. This is a direct continuation of article 1, where he said that the fullness of being of an action is found in many things, and so we have to know what those things are in order to say whether or not the action is good. In these three articles, he gives just the reason that these three things are the three that matter. He doesn't yet give us how we measure them. Right? What is it that makes these things good or evil? That'll come later. There are a few challenges here. The three things to look at are object, circumstance, and end. By object, we just mean the thing that is done or made or acquired. You might think of it as the grammatical object of the action, the direct object of the verb, so to speak, the circumstances in which that action is done, and the end for which it is done, why it is done. End shouldn't come as any surprise given what we've said in some previous questions. There are problems, though, and we're not going to get into all of them, but there are definitely some issues with the way Aquinas talks about object. He's not always completely clear about what he means. Some of his examples sort of muddy the waters a little bit. And so there's a whole history of controversy over how best to interpret what he means when he says object. And even if we can solve that, we're going to keep that one as simple as we can. In any particular case, as you are acting as a moral agent, it might not be easy to correctly identify what the object is. What do we mean here? What is the direct object of my action in this case? That's not trivial. Another problem here is just how sharply we should distinguish these three things. Are they really three discrete parts, like quantitative parts of a stapler? How closely related are they? As Aquinas goes on to talk more and more about circumstances, he's going to say some things that make them very similar, perhaps indistinguishable from the object or from the end. And as we go into the future articles of question 18, that becomes a little bit more of a problem. Similarly, the things that he says about object and end, especially in some of the interpretations when we're battling over how to read this, they're pretty similar. And again, even if we can resolve those similarities, we need to relate the two. How do the object and the end relate to each other? And that'll take us into the hardest part of the question 18, articles 5 through 7. But we're going to hopefully just get through these three articles without worrying too much about all of that. But know that there are issues, and we can talk about them at length in class. I'm not going to do the three articles in depth. In the future, I may change my mind and go back and make a video for each article. Here, we're going to just try to give a quick overview of the main ideas. I think you're capable now at this point in the class of understanding the objections and the replies reasonably well on your own. I just want to draw your attention to some important parts. So the three objections in Article 2 are all about clearing up our terminology. When we say object, the object of an action, what exactly do we mean? The first objection is playing on the idea that object just means thing, right? Like the way that a pen is an object, or a cup is an object, or a tree, or a desk, or a person, whatever. And we don't quite mean that, although it's close. We mean something sort of like that. It's very similar to the way it was easy to confuse means as the thing that we're using, as opposed to the way it relates to our will, right? As something that is willed for the sake of something else. There's a lot of parallels between the way he talks about means and the way he talks about object. Similarly, we are going to talk about the object being the matter of the action, right? The subject matter of the action, but that's very importantly not the same thing as the Aristotelian matter and form analysis when you're trying to talk about substances. In fact, it's the opposite. The object plays the reverse role. It's not the material out of which the action is made. And then objection 3, we would spend probably a lot of time on it if this were its own video. We need to go back and think again about the way the powers are specified by their objects. Remember that from question 8. We're going to go back to the relationship between object and power and talk about active powers and passive powers and the way the will is sort of both. So how we've used object before, we have to be a little careful how we integrate all of those previous statements into what we're going to say here. Said contra, probably deserves some time. It's a little bit of a complicated one. He gives a citation from the Old Testament, from the prophet Hosea, and then he interprets it. And that interpretation allows him to draw a conclusion about evil, which he can then, because good and evil are contraries, apply to good. So they became abominable as those things which they loved. They were detested or hated by God because of the things that they loved. But man becomes abominable to God on account of the malice of action. And malice just means badness, the evilness of action. So the malice of action must be according to the evil objects that we love. Badness of action comes from evil object. And we can apply the reverse. Right? Goodness of action comes from goodness of object. There's a lot going on in that one. So we could give a line-by-line explanation if necessary in class. The respondio begins with a pretty simple claim, and then we're going to go on to elaborate with some examples, some contrasting, some comparisons. The first thing that belongs to the fullness of being seems to be that which gives a thing its species. That's our general claim. Whether we're talking about substances or actions, we first want to know, what is it that makes it the kind of thing that it is? That's all species means, right? Kind. Well, in natural things, species comes from form. The substantial form is what makes it the kind of thing that it is, in the sense of matter and form. An action works the same way. It gets its species, it's the kind of thing that it is, from its object. Object plays the role of form. It's actually a really simple analogy, like a PSAT kind of analogy. Form is to substance as object is to action. And he gives the quick explanation there as movement from term. We actually define movements, Aquinas does, according to their end state. Right? That's what makes it the kind of movement that it is. And that's what the object is. That's the termination of the action in a way. The action terminates in the object. So object plays the role of form, and that's the first thing that we should look at. Now we're going to elaborate a little bit. And what I've done here is I've got the rest of the text of the respondio, or at least most of it, in 2 columns, and we should read it top to bottom and then left to right. We're going to do the reverse. We're going to skip through the text a little bit to show the comparisons. Just as the primary goodness of a natural thing is from its form, which gives it its species. All right, now go to the right instead of going down. The primary evil in natural things is when a generated thing does not realize its specific form. For instance, if instead of a man, something else be generated. That's a very strange example. It's going to strike a pretty sour note for us, I think. He means something like a monster, right? Instead of talking about humans giving birth to centaurs or minotaurs or whatever, I think we should probably just talk about artifacts. And I'm not sure why he didn't stick with artifacts as his first example here. When you're talking about building a boat, you're going to take materials and you're going to form them into a boat. You're going to actualize potencies. Well, you could have lots of defects in the boat. You could make the boat badly in a lot of different ways, or the boat could become damaged over time. But you could hopefully see that you could make the boat so badly that you don't even really successfully get the form of boat into the materials. It doesn't have a bottom. It's not even really a boat. It just, as soon as you put it in the water, it sinks. You haven't really actualized it fully. Maybe that's because of a defect of the materials. Maybe that's because of a defect of the agent. And that's going to be the first and most basic and most obvious evil. That's a bad boat. Like, that's so bad, that ain't even really a boat. If you wanted to try to talk about it with living things, it becomes trickier, I think. Extreme birth defects or defects in generation wouldn't quite qualify, I think, not for us at least, the way we would want to talk about it. Something that goes wrong with cellular division early on, so that, say, a heart never successfully forms and miscarriage results at 7 weeks or something like that. Well, the problem is it's still a human for those first few weeks, right, genetically and whatnot. So to get a natural example or generation example, you'd probably have to have something where something goes wrong in the fertilization of the ovum, right? Like conception never even really happens at all. That's one we could get into. It's like a biomedical ethics question as well. So we can fight about that another time. Now let's talk about actions. Right? So now we'll go to the next line. The primary goodness of moral action is derived from its suitable object. For fans of St. Anselm of Canterbury, that suitable should sound a little familiar. That's conveniens. So if you were my Form 3 student, when we read Cur Deus Homo, we talked a lot about conveniens, convenient, something being suitable or fitting or appropriate or harmonious or beautiful. It's one of Anselm's favorite kinds of arguments, favorite ideas philosophically. And here Aquinas is using it, that the object must somehow be fitting, suited to the action. And the primary evil of an action is when it's not, when the object of the action is not suited to the action. And then he gives examples. For a suitable object, he uses the phrase to make use of what is one's own, uti res sua in Latin. And by contrast, for evil object, to take what belongs to another, which hopefully you recognize as theft. And there the Latin is accipere aliena. Now there is a little bit of uncertainty here about what exactly the example is. Is the object the whole phrase, the verb and its direct object? In the case of uti res sua, it's not technically a direct object. There's a little bit of a weird grammar to the verb of uti, but same idea. In accipere aliena, it's very basic. We've got a verb, and we got its direct object. Is the object, as he's giving the example, accipere aliena, taking what belongs to another, or is it just aliena? It belongs to another. I think, given the way he talks about it here, the most natural way to read it in isolation from some later examples is that aliena is the object. Aliena is not suitable. It's not suited to the verb accipere. Taking things is fine. Taking what belongs to another is not. We could give different kinds of direct objects, right? To take what is offered to you, that object is fine. When I give my money to the cashier and the cashier takes my money, that's not theft. It's a transaction, it's exchange, it's a different kind of object. That one's suitable. So the first thing here is this idea of the object being suitable to the action. The reply to the first objection simplifies all of that, or doesn't. It summarizes it all pretty nicely. External things, substances, they are good in themselves. That's true. The objector was just playing off of the convertibility argument, right? Things are good in themselves, so how can objects be bad? How can objects make things bad? It is true that they are good in themselves, but they are not necessarily suited to this or that action. They don't always have a due proportion, again, similar conveniens language, although it's debitum there, I think, to this or that action. So considered as the object of the action, they don't have the quality of goodness. Apart from the action, sure, that's fine. In fact, apart from action, everything just in itself is good insofar as it exists. You're not going to get anything interesting there, ethically speaking. But how it is suited to this action or to that action, that's a different matter entirely. And so the bottom line for object is that an action with a wrong kind of object is a wrong kind of action. When you lose that proportion between the action and its object, that's the primary way in which the action can go wrong. And that's Article 2. Article 3, circumstance. This one needs its own video. We'll see what we can do with a quick summary. So we skipped circumstances the first time around. In question 7, Articles 1 through 4, as soon as he's done talking about human acts, voluntary acts in question 6, which is where we started this year, he then moves on to talk about the circumstances of action. And we skipped it so that we could do it now, sort of all at once. His treatment of circumstance in question 7 is it's a little bit more involved than we want to get into. Circumstance literally means those things that stand around. In this case, stand around an action. So it's sto, stare, that's the stance part of the word, and circum, around, like circumference. Aquinas describes circumstances in a few different ways, but particular conditions of an act is a nice one, I think. And we saw that kind of terminology back in question 6, article 6. The first time this ever came up was the fear article, when we were arguing about whether or not we could abstract our action from all of the particular circumstances surrounding the action. It was about circumstance. He was introducing it for the first time. What he's claiming here in Article 3 is very similar to the kind of thing he said in Article 2. We have another analogy. Circumstances are to action as accidents are to substances. So we have to go back and have a really quick look at what we mean by substance and accidents. This is one of the Aristotelian modes of analysis of substances. When you want to talk about things and the way they're composed of parts, there's more than one way to do that. And one of the famous ones is substance and accidents. In Form 3, when we talked about divine simplicity, I perhaps taught you guys about substance and accidents. I don't always cover this one with Form 3. I always go over matter and form, act and potency, essence and existence, and then usually one or two others, depending on how the questions are going. So some years I talk about this one, and other years I do not. However, if you took the Form 4 class at St. Anselm's, then you definitely talked about substance and accidents. Very important for a number of things, probably most famously talking about the Eucharist and transubstantiation. And the other reason I know you talked about it is that the Form 4 religion teacher is a metaphysician, and he loves talking about substance and accidents. So hopefully this is a review if you've had classes at the Abbey School before. When we analyze a substance, or a thing rather, we can talk about just the substance that's there, and then all of the accidents or maybe properties, features of it. We're going to speak a little bit loosely here, and we're not going to try to get too technical. Technically, a substance is being that does not inhere in another. An accident is being that does inhere in something else, but that's not the most helpful thing if you're just starting out as a student. So on the right, I've got a very standard and dumb example of substance and accidents. The fact that I have brown hair, or we can take a fictional human. I don't have brown hair anymore. You've got a human with brown hair and blue eyes, and they're 6 feet tall, and they weigh 220, and they're born in Washington, and they live in Maryland, and you could go on and on and on. All of those features, brown hair, blue eyes, et cetera, they could change in lots of ways, and you'd still be a human. Right? Part of the reason to do this analysis is to explain what's changing and how big of a change is it. If I lose all my hair, I'm still a human. If my hair goes from brown to gray, still a human. Or if I dye it purple. If my blue eyes fade with age and become gray. If you, as a student, grow 2 more inches, so you're not 6 feet tall, now you're 6'2", the accident of your height has changed. It just so happens that you're 6 feet tall, and now it just so happens that you're 6'2". You're still a human. You could lose weight, right? Someone could go from 220 to 190, still human. You could be born somewhere. You could have been born in another place. You could live somewhere else. So the accidents are the things that can change without the substance changing. The substance remains what it is. Whereas, when you're shot and buried and you die and you're buried in the ground and you become worm food, the thing in the ground is not a human anymore. It's the remains. It's the remains. It's all the parts that used to make up a human. And eventually those parts are digested by other things. So that's the basic take on substance and accidents, very basic. And all Aquinas is claiming is that in action, circumstances play the role of accidents. Now, if that's right, if circumstances are just accidents, the things that can change without the basic thing changing, then should they matter for the action being good or evil? Doesn't seem like it. That's the first objection. It would seem that an action is not good or evil from circumstance, because circumstances are the things that stand around an action, as we said a minute ago. But good and evil aren't the kinds of things that stand around the action. They're in them things themselves. Right? We need to be touching the essence of the thing to talk about good and evil. He's citing Metaphysics, Book 6, but just from what we've done over the last few questions, hopefully that's clear as well. So an action couldn't possibly derive its goodness or its evil, its malice, from circumstance. If they aren't essential to the act, why would they matter for good or evil? Or a hopefully intuitive set of questions. Why does it matter what time of day it is when I steal from you? That's a circumstance, right? Or what room we're in when I steal from you? That's a circumstance. Why would those things matter? That's not clear at all. It's a nice objection. The sed contra, funny enough, plays the same kind of game. So I feel like the objection is pretty intuitive, and the sed contra comes back with an equally intuitive counter. We're going to cite Aristotle, and it's such a good objection it could almost just be the respondo, at least for our purposes. If you want the bottom line answer, this is it. It's the sed contra. Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics, a virtuous person acts as they should, when they should, and so on, in respect of other circumstances. And on the other hand, the vicious person, in the matter of each vice, acts when they shouldn't, where they shouldn't, and so on. Those are all circumstances. So there's a time and a place for everything. This is a statement about the circumstances of action. Human actions are good or evil according to circumstance. Where and when and in what way and other types of phrasings, they're all circumstances, and they can pretty clearly matter. Something might be okay to do when you're at home and not okay to do in the middle of class or while you're supposed to be at Mass or something like that, right? When it's the time for prayer. So circumstances can matter. The question is, when do they matter and how and why do they? Like, can we give a theoretical account here? The theoretical account is interesting. We're going to get into accidents again a little bit. In natural things, substances again, it is to be noted that the whole fullness of perfection due to a thing is not from the mere substantial form. It's not only from the substantial form, giving it its species, although that's the first thing, because a thing derives much from supervening accidents, as man does from shape, color, and the like. And if any one of these accidents be out of due proportion, evil is the result. So some accidents matter. Somehow they're more fundamental. If you think back to the dumb diagram of the human, right? Sure, you could weigh 190 pounds, or you could weigh 220 pounds, or you could weigh more or weigh less. But as you start going in the extremes, 300 pounds, 400 pounds, 500 pounds, you're becoming extremely unhealthy in either direction, right? You'd be malnourished if you weigh 45 pounds or whatever. And similarly, obesity is when you're going the other direction. That's not a healthy human. So that we have weight's an accident in some way, and there's some reasonable range of values for it, but you can go outside of them. And that accident does in some way matter. So, or a sillier example, changing the color of my hair doesn't really change anything important about me, but changing the number of legs that I have does, right? I'm a biped. Well, if I lose a leg, I'm not a biped anymore, and I'm supposed to be a biped. So when he's talking about shape or color and the like, he's talking about those kinds of things. Skin color, he doesn't mean that there's an ideal skin color. That would be a little strange. But there are eye colors and skin colors that are in some sense signals of unhealth, right? Like whether I'm very dark skinned or very light skinned may not matter, but we eventually start talking about real defects, like albinism starts to become, there are serious health consequences of being an albino. So accidents, they do matter in some way. In natural things. Some of them do. There are fundamental ones that matter. Well, it turns out it's the same with action. The plenitude of the goodness of action does not consist wholly in its species. He's essentially just using the exact same language from earlier on the previous slide, but also in certain additions which accrue to it by reason of certain accidents. And such are its due circumstances, the circumstances that matter, the circumstances that ought to be there. Wherefore, if something be wanting, lacking, that is requisite as a due circumstance, the action will be evil. So some matter, some don't. Most don't, depending how broadly you want to define circumstance, but some will. How do we know which ones matter and which ones don't? Tough question. We're going to give an answer to that question later. Probably the most important answer is prudence, the virtue of prudence. But then you can make a list. In fact, in question 7, Aquinas does give a list of the circumstances that, generally speaking, we should be looking at. But how would you even apply that list is also a big question. Circumstances are almost infinite. They are many, many, many-fold. We can say it again, perhaps slightly more helpfully, hopefully, in one of the replies to the objections. This one's reply to objection 2. every accident is not accidentally in its subject. For some are proper accidents or essential accidents. I think it's per se there. I don't think proper is the best English. And of these, every art takes notice. And thus it is that the circumstances of actions are considered in the doctrine of morals. The language for saying that some circumstances matter and others do not is, in my opinion, hilarious. Because you can talk about circumstances that just happen to be the case, accidental accidents, and accidents that are in some way, I'm crossing the language. So circumstances that just happen to be the case, they're accidental circumstances, and then essential ones, circumstances that are in some way essential to the action. Those we care about. You have to have at least a little bit of a sense of humor to see that Aquinas is talking about accidents as well, and therefore we're talking about essential accidents and accidental accidents, which is ridiculous. But based on something he's going to say later, complicating things a lot in Article 10, you can say that some circumstances touch directly upon the object, or they're some kind of specification of the object. They're much more directly related to the object, and lots of circumstances are not. It's the ones that are, or the ones that are proper, per se accidents, those matter. Difficult article, probably needs its own video, but we're going fast today. All right, now finally Article 4, the third part of action that needs to be good for the action to be good, the end. This should be the least surprising of all of them. This is where we started in question 8. And I want to show you the first objection as a student test. It's a good test your abilities moment, because you should instantly recognize this objection and what's going on in it. And you should know the answer without reading the reply to the objection. This is objection 1. I'm not going to tell you the answer to this objection. You shouldn't even have to go read it. You should know it. I'll ask you in class. You can drop a comment down below if you really want. It would seem that the good and evil in human actions are not from the end, for Dionysius says, hey, we've heard of that guy before, in his book on the Divine Names, chapter 4, nothing acts with a view to evil. If, therefore, an action were good or evil from its end, no action would be evil, which is clearly false. So this is, again, just question 8, Articles 1 and 2. It's the convertibility of transcendentals again. It's the privation theory of evil again. No surprises. So hopefully you know the answer. He's already given the answer to this in question 8. Nothing acts with a view to evil. If an action were good or evil from its end, no action would be evil, because they're always good. There's actually a slight logical error in this objection as well, which Aquinas doesn't bother addressing. And that is the conclusion that the objector is drawing is slightly too broad. If an action were good or evil from its end, no action would be evil by its end. It could still be evil in some other way, right? It's just that end would never matter for talking about an action being evil. All right. Now, the second objection I also want to look at, and this one I'll even give you the answer to, or I'll help you see the answer to. Objection 2 gives us a really helpful example that Aquinas has already brought up a little bit in Article 2, and that we want to be able to address with some clarity. This is going to be helpful going into future articles. A good action may happen to be ordained to an evil end, as when a man gives alms from vainglory. Conversely, an evil action may happen to be ordained to a good end, such as theft, committed to give something to the poor. Therefore, an action is not good or evil from its end. So, giving alms is a good action. It's still a good action, even if it's done for a bad end. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to say, well, it's not good to give alms to the poor anymore. That's weird, right? And the same in reverse. Theft is bad. It's a bad action. Just because you do it for a good end doesn't mean theft becomes good, does it? Well, lots of contemporary ethics gets confused on this point, so I guess we shouldn't take it for granted. My students talk about this and discuss this with me in class every year, so it needs a closer look. And what we're doing in looking at Articles 2, 3, and 4 is acquiring the terminology to accurately state what's going on here. But the objector is bringing it up to say the end clearly can't matter. A good action ordained to an evil end remains a good action, and a bad action ordained to a good end remains a bad action, so end is irrelevant. Nice objection. Now, once again, we're going to make the convertibility claim, right? The disposition of things as to goodness is the same as their disposition to beings. We're going to play that game again. Now, in some things, Being does not depend on another, and in these cases, it suffices to consider their being absolutely. No dependency, it just is, it just exists. Well, that's actually only true of one thing, God. Simply speaking, it's only God. In some particular series or limited domain, you could say that relatively speaking, something doesn't depend on others in that set, but simply speaking, it's only true of God. But there are things, meaning everything else that exists, all created things, there are things, the being of which does depend on something else. And in their regard, we must consider their being in relation to the cause on which it depends. This is a really big claim, really important for lots of different things you might try to do in Aquinas or in Aristotle. Until you know something's cause, you don't fully know the thing. This is, in some sense, what all of science is predicated on. Yeah? That we come to understand the effects by discovering what their causes are. Now, for Aristotle, and for Aquinas following him, you hopefully have heard before, we may have to spend some more time on this, you've heard that it's not just one kind of causation in Aristotle. Aristotle considers 4 causes: the material, the formal, the efficient or agent cause, and the final cause. So we might put up some bonus readings on this, but there are 4 different kinds of causes you could look at. You could talk about the stuff it's made out of being a cause, or an explanation of why this thing is the way that it is. That might be a way of talking about cause here. So, well, you need to talk about the stuff it's made out of. That's part of the story of why it is the thing that it is, how it works. You need to look at the formal cause. What is the form or the shape that's been given to that matter? The efficient cause is the one that actually introduces the form, the one that combines matter and form. Although we can say some fancy things there. We won't get into too much here. And then there's the final cause, its end, what it's for. And if you know all 4 of those causes, then you really know the thing. Well, final cause just means the end cause, so hopefully you know which of the 4 causes we're about to care about. So when you look at the being of a substance, its being depends on the agent cause, or the efficient cause, and the formal cause. You need to know the agent, you need to know the form. He doesn't actually look at the material cause. We can talk about why another time. But the goodness of a thing depends on its end. And you already know that, although we didn't really make a big deal out of it, because that's just all the middle steps of the convertibility argument. All of those steps in the convertibility argument, we're talking about perfection. So premises 2 and 3, or depending on how you number them, right? The move from desire to perfection and perfection to actual, and all the things we say about perfection in there. We're talking about end. So end and goodness and end very much go together. The good is the true final cause. It's what draws all things. So if you talk about God, well, God's goodness doesn't depend on anything else. God just is his own goodness. So you don't actually have to look at an end unless you meant something like God is his own end. You wanted to talk about the way in which God loves himself. This is the way in which he does. Okay, but in human actions and everything else other than God, the goodness of those things depends on something else. And they have a measure of their goodness from the end on which they depend. Notice that, interestingly, we're not even really making an analogy here. In Articles 2 and 4, there was an analogy. But here, human action, just like all substances that are created, they all depend on their end. We just mean end slightly differently for the 2 things. But they have a measure of goodness from the end on which they depend, because the end is in some way the cause of the action. Now we get a really fast, easy summary of all of the first 4 articles, the last 3, Articles 2, 3, and 4. We could talk about a 4-fold goodness in human action. First, because it's just an action. This is the way in which everything that exists, insofar as it exists, is good. Like, it just is. So it's generically good. That's fine. As much as it has of action and being, so much has it of goodness. That's actually not ethically interesting. The ones that are ethically interesting are the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th. It has goodness according to its species, derived from its suitable object. It has goodness from its circumstances, which are like its accidents. And it has goodness from its end, which is the cause of its goodness. And if you memorize that, then you've memorized something really helpful. There's your answer. There's your lines to memorize. But also, We need to look at one more reply to the objections, because this is reply to objection 2. This is the one we looked at with theft for feeding the poor, right? The separability of action and an end. And this is a great application of the respondeat. We should really expand on this. If we make this needs its own video, I think, Article 4, someday. Nothing hinders an action that is good in one of the ways mentioned above, Articles 2 through 4, from lacking goodness in another. And thus it may happen that an action which is good in its species or in its circumstances is ordained to an evil end, or vice versa. The objector was right. He just wasn't fully utilizing all the terminology that Aquinas is trying to give us. When you say that theft to feed the poor is still a good action, what you mean is the action is good by its object, or evil by its object, I'm sorry. Theft is to take what belongs to another. By object, it's evil. By end, it's good. Or the reverse. When you say to give alms for vainglory, the end is evil, but the action by its object is good. It's too simplifying to say the action is still good. What we actually want to say is something more like this. Yes, feeding the poor is good, but your concrete action as the agent, what you are doing in this case, is evil. You are doing an evil thing. Theft is evil. And what you are doing is evil because you are stealing. You're stealing for a good end, but what you're doing is still evil. And it works in the other direction as well, when you have a good object and an evil end. What you, the agent, are doing in these concrete circumstances is bad, not by object, but by end. But an action, as we have said in Article 1, and as we must repeatedly emphasize in all of these articles, an action is not good simply unless it is good in all of those ways. Here's another one to memorize from the divine names. Evil results from any single defect. Good from the complete cause. Make a truth table for the 3 parts, right? Object, circumstance, end. What are all your results? Well, you're going to have good or evil, right? G or E in every cell. So you could have good, 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 evil, good, evil, good, evil, good, good, and then we can go 2 at a time, right? Easy. Make the truth table. But you don't really have to if you just want an easy answer, because there's only one time the action is simply good, and that's if you have good, good, and good. You have to have a good object with the good circumstances being good, and the end also being good. And if anything in the table shows up as evil, the action is evil. The whole act is evil. Parts of the action are good, and it might be really helpful for counseling people, for teaching people, for assessing in hindsight your own actions. It might be really good to be able to separate, to distinguish. All right, well, good object, evil end. Maybe it's important to praise people for the good for their good intention, and criticize them for their evil object. Maybe that's really important. Maybe that's how you teach children. Right? So parts can be good, but if any part is evil, the whole action is evil, and the person has done an evil. And that's Articles 2 through 4. And this here on the right is how you apply those 3 parts to the particular cases brought up by the objector in Article 4. All right, we're going to stop the video there. That's plenty long. If you have any questions about this, obviously we're going to have class together. And meantime, good luck with your studying, and God bless.